Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next webinar in the EUCOPE Life Sciences series. So today we will be talking about the EU HTA procedure and building on the webinar which we organized about 6 months ago last summer. I will be going through some of the details. There's been a lot of activity in the past year, a lot of implementing acts that have been decided now by the member states. And right before the holidays, really a flurry of new guidance documents that really you need to be aware of. So very happy to have with me today the EUCOPE Secretary General, Dr. Alexander Natz. Hello, Alex.
Hi, thanks, Matias, for organizing this. Thanks to the whole team. It's a pleasure to be here, and let's make this an interactive discussion. I'm very much looking forward to have this important discussion with you and the whole EUCOPE community and everyone who wants to ask questions should come in at any time, raising your hand, just asking questions. I think this should be an interactive discussion. So welcome, everyone.
Yes, exactly. Please to participate in the chat with your questions. Raise your hand. We will try to bring you in if there's anything that's unclear. If you have any questions or comments as well that you want to share with other participants, this webinar is really for you. We have quite a nice agenda planned for today. So we'll start with just a very brief introduction of what regulation is, the phased implementation, and the products in scope, which is good to just be on the same page. And then we will be going into the two main procedures, the joint scientific consultations. Here, there's been some more information about the request periods for this year. There's been a further elaboration of the selection criteria, and we know now the JSC timeline. So we want to go into the details there. And then second, we will look at the joint clinical assessments, the timeline and the major milestones there. There's been a bit more information about the scoping procedure, and we had some further writing down of what this PICO consolidation, the comparator selection and consolidation will look like. I think this is something that is quite interesting to look at into further details. And then, of course, towards the end, we will have a Q&A. But before that, we will provide a bit of our thinking about how we can prepare for these procedures. It's a completely new procedure, and no one has really gone through this yet. I think everyone has a lot of questions, so we have been putting our heads together and thinking a bit about how we can put your best foot forward. So to start off, let's look at what this procedure includes. There are two main procedures to be aware of. There's the joint scientific consultations. This is really a continuation of early advice. A lot of you are probably already familiar with this from either the regulatory setting, where you can have scientific advice from the European Medicines Agency, or from national advice procedures such as those in Germany. Now, under the EU HTA procedure, you will be able to also request joint scientific consultation. You can do that in parallel with the EMA, and we'll be looking a bit further into what that looks like. The joint clinical assessments, this is, of course, the main part of HTA at the EU level now. It comes before any national HTA procedures start. It is in parallel with the EMA procedure. However, the competence of deciding on pricing reimbursement still remains with the member states, and therefore there are no value judgments in the JCA report. However, any evidence and data that is submitted in the JCA cannot be requested again at the national level, and therefore a lot of the important things data will already be gathered and looked at as part of this joint clinical assessment. We'll be looking a bit further into the details. And then I think it's important to mention as well that there's voluntary cooperation, and there's also horizon scanning happening. We'll see how this voluntary cooperation might come in under some of the parts of these procedures. So what products are really subject to joint clinical assessments? It is really any new chemical, biological, or radiopharmaceutical active substance where there's a marketing authorization for a product with a new active substance submitted to the European Medicines Agency after the dates which you see on the left-hand side. So already now, from the 12th of January this year, any oncology products or cell and gene therapies that are submitted to the EMA, where there's a new indication, these are subject to a joint clinical assessment, a mandatory joint clinical assessment. Then from the 13th of January 2028, this will also be extended to orphan medicinal products. And from the 13th of January 2030, so 5 years from now, all centrally authorized medicinal products where there's a new active substance submitted to the EMA will have to go through a joint clinical assessment. I should note that medical devices, they were originally intended to also have the first JCAs for medical devices this year. We understand the first joint clinical assessments of medical devices, IVDs, will be happening from 2026. Some of the final rules are still being written there, and we're following this as well.
Can I
Yes.
interrupt you, Matias? Sorry for that, but and also the audience come in with any question. What about the medical devices? I mean, it's clear that from 2026, IVDs and medical devices could be subject to the procedure, but do we have more information about how they are selected? And what's the timeline before that selection? Is it like in 2025, I would know that I'm eligible for that procedure as a medical device or IVD, or when would I know that I need to prepare? Because preparation is key in this whole process. So I would want to know as early as possible from the device perspective or from the device developer perspective. So knowing only a few days in advance is probably tricky.
Mm-hmm. This is a very good point, and please feel free to come in the audience as well. What we do understand is that they will be selected by an implementing act. We know that the regulation says that there are certain criteria to be used as well. Of course, there are only those medical devices and IVDs that are classified as high-risk devices. So that already gives you a better understanding of if your medical device might be in scope. And then they will also be selected according to a few criteria as well, as to whether they are pertinent to the EU research agenda, addressing unmet medical needs, etc.
But if they do it quite a bit in advance by way of an implementing act, it's probably like there is a time in between they are selecting those products, because an implementing act is an official act of the European Commission. So there's probably some time in between the selection process and the final dossier submission for those devices, I would assume. We have one question in the chat. When are combination products subject to the JCA? Do you want to kick us off on this one, or?
Yeah, happy to do so. I think that's a really good question. So here again, as you see, whether a product is subject to the JCA or not, you have to already notify EMA when you have your pre-authorization submission. You have to notify that you might be under the JCA according to your own view. But at the end of the day, it's subject to a decision of the EMA, whether it's a new chemical, biological, radiopharmaceutical active substance. Now, when it comes to, it's a combination product, for example, in oncology, when there's a pharmaceutical and device component. Here, you really need to look if let's say if the pharmaceutical substance comes under JCA, that will certainly be under JCA, and would be good to clarify then probably with the European Commission whether the device component as well would come under.
Yeah, I would also add, if I may, I think the regulatory status governs. So if the regulatory status of a combination product is a pharmaceutical, is a medicinal product, then this would be considered a medicinal product, and you will have to look at the eligibility criteria under pharmaceuticals. So if it's in regulatory terms a pharmaceutical, then it should also be a pharmaceutical in the EU HTA context. And if it is finally a medical device, at the end of the day, the whole concept, the whole product, then you would have to be called into the procedure by way of implementing act. And if it's by regulatory terms, two separate procedure like a test and a medicinal product, I would assume that only the medicine would then go into the process, into the EU HTA. If it, for example, has an oncology indication, it would go as a medicine, but the test in itself, the diagnostic test, might not be a part of the procedure if it's not called in. But that's you really have to look at the regulatory status. But the next question, which I think leads us directly into your next slide, which is, what is the definition of an oncology product? I think I've seen that on the slide deck. So we come to that point.
Yes, exactly. Very good question, Douglas, and preempting a bit that the question, because oncology products, of course, can mean a lot of different things. Just before we go into that, I think it's important to note that if you have let's say if you have a follow-on indication to a product, that second indication, third indication is only subject to a joint clinical assessment if the first indication has already gone through a JCA. So that means that you will have some overlap during this implementation period where you have a product that, if it has already been submitted prior to this date, and the first indication did not go through joint clinical assessment, and the following indication will also not trigger joint clinical assessment. So yes, indeed, here we have the definition of oncology treatment, and I would recommend anyone who to really go look into the details. I've not included everything here, but really the most important aspects of it, because it's quite detailed. There's a guidance document that was adopted last summer by the HTA Coordination Group, where they define cancer as all malignant and borderline, as well as neoplasms of uncertain whether benign or malignant, as, let's say, this is their working definition of cancer. And then when it comes to how an oncology treatment is defined, because it's really a treatment of cancer, this covers all anti-neoplastic agents, so modulators and enhancers and adjuvant treatments, chemotherapy, biologic therapies, hormonal agents that produce anti-tumor, cytotoxic, or cytostatic effects, or therapies that increase sensitivity of malignant cells to other anti-neoplastic treatments. Now, not included here is interventions that don't have a curative or anti-tumor effects, such as treating only the symptoms, such as pain, nausea, as well as, quite important as well, if it's purely a diagnostic agent as well. These are generally excluded. However, again, I want to emphasize that here it can be quite important to really double check to make sure that you have a good understanding, really checking with regulatory colleagues, and it's also possible, of course, to have a clarification at the end of the day when it comes to the definition of an oncology treatment. This will be confirmed by the HTA Coordination Group.
Great. So PSMA tracers, radiopharmaceuticals not really being a treatment would per se be excluded from the oncology scope of the procedure, but they might come in on another ticket later on as an orphan or as another centrally approved medicine. So it's only a temporary exclusion, I would say, right? Because they're not.
Yes. No, exactly. This is very fair. And so then it would say if an orphan would come in from 13th January 2028, or if not under the general ticket being assessed by the EMA in 2030.
Great. Thanks.
Keep those questions coming if you have them, or comments as well in the chat. So just very briefly before we go into the details, I think it's very good to really know, because we have a lot of new governance bodies and new roles for existing institutions here. What are the different roles and responsibilities? So we have the new HTA Coordination Group. This is really the governance body of the member states' HTA bodies. They make the final decisions. They have delegated their work to different subgroups. Really chief among those are the joint clinical assessment subgroups and the joint scientific consultation subgroups, but they also have subgroups for developing methodological guidance and performing horizon scanning. Then the European Commission, they will provide the HTA Secretariat. So they have a team within DG Santé, which is performing this function, and they provide secretary support to the coordination group. They are also acting as the contact point for companies. So that's important to keep in mind. And they also do perform a number of functions throughout the joint clinical assessment, such as performing the completeness check of the dossier submitted, to identify individual experts for joint scientific consultations, joint clinical assessments for those subgroups. And they also consider and make the final decision on what information will be published and what should remain confidential. That's quite an important role as well. And we have the HTA Stakeholder Network. So they're really a network of stakeholder associations representing industry, patients, clinicians. This stakeholder network may propose individual experts for joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments. And they also provide comments on the Coordination Group annual work program. Finally, the European Medicines Agency, quite important role as well in sharing related information from the marketing authorization application with the HTA Coordination Group that is relevant for the JCA, and also share some early information submitted by companies for horizon scanning purposes.
So just if I may quickly come in, there's another question, but just to emphasize, I think the the key stakeholder in this process is the HTA Coordination Group. It's a member state-driven group, which is defining the PICO schemes, which is defining the comparators, which are so important for these processes, because although there is no decision-making at the EU or AC level in these processes, but I mean, the direction of travel will be very much set by the PICO scheme, by the comparator, and so on and so forth. So this process is not to be underestimated, even though there is no final grading at the end of this process, but it's a preparation and it's an assessment of the data provided, but it also sets very much the frame of future national pricing and reimbursement decisions and processes. So I think the HTA Coordination Group, just wanted to emphasize that, is, in my opinion, the key group. The Commission is more like a secretariat. Will be interesting to see if the Commission would give guidance in terms of eligibility of products for that process, because we've seen in national HTA procedures that has very often been the question, am I in or out? Do I have full regulatory data protection under AMNOG, which calls me into AMNOG, or would I only have plus 1 year or orphan exclusivity, which in the previous times didn't call you into AMNOG? Those important questions will be interesting to see. I would probably address them to the HTA Secretariat, to the Commission, which provides the legal framework and probably also an interpretation of it. The other two groups, I mean, the European Medicines Agency is always important, but in this process, it's probably less important than the HTA Coordination Group and also the stakeholder network. We are part of that network as EUCOPE. So if you have any questions or issues you want to file in that network, please let us know. Send those questions over to us. But it's more like engaging the stakeholder. It's not the real decision maker. I just wanted to put that in perspective. And then we have a question. Could you talk about serognostics as well? When are they going to be subject to the JCA, and how are they approached? Do you want to kick us off on this one, Matias? I can also try, but
yeah, no, absolutely. I think again, this is a prime example of where you really need to look into the details of it, because of course with a theranostic you have a combination of a radiopharmaceutical which is meant for diagnosis, and then another radiopharmaceutical that is meant for treatment. So then I believe the question is, would they be seen together in the JCA, or would you just have the radiopharmaceutical that is used for treatment then let's say assessed in the JCA? And I think this is really a question where you need a bit more really some detailed information to then engage the European Commission as the HTA Secretariat to give some feedback. So yeah, Alex, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on this one.
No, I think it's very much as we mentioned before. I think you really have to look at the regulatory status. Is it a drug or device? If it's really an integrated combination product, it's a case-by-case decision when you're in or when you're out. But then you go, if you're separate products, you would probably assess those products in separation and look at the medicine. If that's a centrally approved medicine, which is also an orphan, it would come in 2028. If it has an oncology indication, it comes in earlier. It's already in now. And let's not forget about the fact it's always about the marketing authorization application. It's not about the marketing authorization itself, what calls you in. So it's about the application. But yeah, details remain to be seen. Nothing to add from my end. Thanks.
And I should mention as well, because I think there will be a lot of these questions, especially now in the transition period in the next couple of months, as people are let's say, reviewing whether it will be under this procedure in the next couple of years. And there will be a formal Q&A document developed by the European Commission. So hopefully a lot of those questions will be clarified there, but there will still be open questions. And we're, of course, very happy to help if you have any questions at all on this point.
Yes, let us know if you have any questions coming anytime. Sorry. Go ahead.
So really, what has been adopted now in the last year? There's been a lot of implementing acts, but more importantly, there has also been a lot of guidance documents which really explain some of those implementing acts, but also provide a bit further details as well, and a bit of thinking from the HTA Coordination Group and the Commission on how this procedure will work. So We had a full list of the guidance documents that were adopted on 28th of November by the HTA Coordination Group here. We'll be really looking at some of that procedural guidance for JCA and for joint scientific consultations, also the procedural guidance, which sets out the timeline, looking at some of those important guidance documents on the request template, as well as the selection criteria for JSC. So that's a bit what we're diving into today, and all of those can be found on the European Commission website. So going first into joint scientific consultations, the purpose and scope of a joint scientific consultation is that it's really an advice meeting that's provided by two assessors, so two HTA bodies together, that results in an outcome document that outlines the scientific recommendations that have been made. It's important that this needs to be done prior to the start of phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. And that this advice is non-binding. So the JSC outcome document doesn't have any legally binding effect either for companies or for HTA bodies. It does not prejudice anything that will be done in the joint clinical assessment itself. However, at the same time, companies that do receive a joint scientific consultation are asked to explain in the JCA dossier any deviations from the recommended proposition for evidence generation, which was discussed in the JSC. But throughout the JSC itself, it's confidential. It's advice for the company. It's a service for the company. And this can take place in parallel with EMA scientific advice as well.
I mean, if I just to quickly come in, and we have a question which we will take later, very important question, but let me just come in on this one. I mean, yeah, of course, in a way, non-binding advice, I think this is what we know also from the national procedures. And also the outcome of an advice can change over time. If I take advice or get advice like 3 years down the road, and then the standard of care has changed in the meantime, then the advice will probably look different today. So I think industry is very much aware of that. The advice can change, but what we have also learned is to be responsible institutions. The HTA institutions at the national level have very much stick to their scientific advice in the majority of the cases. Again, scientific evidence can change over time, but normally I think the non-binding issue is not an issue here from the legal perspective. What is probably a bit more of an issue, and this is like, I mean, even a bit of a competitive issue, like if I'm in the same indication and my competitor gets advice and I'm not getting advice, I would feel a bit like, why is he getting advice and I'm not getting advice? So I would assume that around the criteria which are set out in the regulation, I mean, there will be a lot of debate about who gets a slot and who will not get a slot. And so I just wanted to bring that into the mix because as a lawyer, I would argue, I mean, equal treatment and right to be heard and so on. I think there are lots of arguments you can make to say, well, I would also want to get the opportunity to speak to the decision maker because it gives my competitor and competitive advantage over me if he had that opportunity. So just wanted to bring that element in. I think that might be an issue. I don't want to get too legal here, but I think it's important that we are on equal footing and that we treat that it's a fair procedure treating companies alike and in the same way. So just wanted to add that point.
I think that's a really good point, and you're really addressing the elephant in the room that this is a really nice offering, of course, but not everyone will be able to receive a slot for such an advice meeting. Fortunately, quite limited. We understand there are 5 or 7 such advice meetings planned for this year. Although the idea is to scale this up, we would like to see more advice meetings offered already this year.
And we get 2 questions, one from Gina here, which is on the JSC, and then another good one from Thomas. Let me summarize them. Gina is asking the question, is the outcome of the JSC made publicly available?
No, so it's not public. It's this is just for a company.
Which is important, which is also the case in most of the national advice procedures. And the other one is more on the JCA, getting back to a point we made before, but I just wanted to follow the order here, which is more like a good question from Thomas here. Like, what is it? Is it explicitly or is there an implicit a verdict of that JCA at the end of the day? I think that's an important one.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and Alex, please feel free to come in with your thoughts. But yeah, so in a way, the member states can do what they want with the JCA report. So it says that they need to annex it to their national HTA decisions. However, there is some limitations on them, so they cannot request again any evidence that has been requested as part of the JCA. However, they can request additional evidence. So this is a bit, let's say, leaves a lot of room for the member states to work around. At the same time, there are a lot of important decisions that are made in the JCA in terms of what comparators to include for that assessment, what evidence that is requested from companies, and also in the terms of, even though, let's say, any studies will not be rejected, maybe you have a single arm trial, for example, you have a historical comparator arm, it will not be rejected, but what will that JCA report be saying about this? Will there just be a conclusion that there was not insufficient evidence to conclude, or too much uncertainty, or will it also mention that the context in which that, the disease context in which that clinical trial will run? So I think these are important things that, it is a borderline judgment, but at the same time, the text is quite clear that there shouldn't be any value judgment. So I think yeah, there's some gray spaces or nuances within there.
Yeah, I very much agree, and I like that question, because always in my opinion, there is an implicit, not a verdict, but there is an implicit result of the exercise. Because I mean, it's a bit like with IQWiG and GBA, for those who know the German procedures. I mean, IQWiG is generating the evidence, is saying that there is evidence on X, Y, that there is no evidence on another endpoint, or they're somewhat criticizing the clinical trial design. And I think in that there is an implicit result of the exercise, and that is certainly, this is why I like the question very much. At the end, I think there is a bit of a verdict, but the final verdict, of course, is with the national decision makers. But this also shows not to underestimate the importance of this. This is not just a data gathering exercise. It's also something like where the data is looked at, where the data is grouped, where certain questions are asked, where certain endpoints are set and comparators are set. So it's very important to get that direction of travel from the beginning in the right direction, to make sure that you're benchmarking against the right comparator. It's extremely important, even though there's no final verdict, I would argue.
Yeah. Good. Then moving ahead, so as we mentioned, there are 5 or 7 JSC slots planned for this year. There will be generally there will be 3 request periods every year. For 2025, there will only be 2. The first one is coming up already between 3rd of February and 3rd of March. This is only for medicinal products. And then the second request period will be the 2nd to 30th of June. This will be for medicinal products and medical devices. So in order to request a JSC slot, you will have to do so via the IT platform. To gain access, you'll need to contact the European Commission. We have the contact details on a later slide. And then within 15 working days after the end of each request period, companies will be informed whether they are selected for JSC or not. It's important to keep in mind that even if you're not selected for JSC, let's say during the first period, it is possible to reapply for another JSC during a subsequent period. And just give an idea of how long this procedure takes overall, it will be around 4.5 months. You mentioned, Alex, you mentioned the eligibility and selection criteria. So now we have, within the regulation, there were these 6, 7 selection criteria mentioned, quite short. And I think we all have been making up our mind about what this means. But now finally we have some guidance that was adopted last year by the coordination group, really explaining how they see these selection criteria. So really, before we dive into it, first of all, in order to even apply for JSC or for product to be eligible, they state that it has to be likely to be subject to a JCA, which means that it's likely to be submitted to the EMA before those applicable dates for different product types. And as we mentioned as well, clinical studies, clinical investigations need to still be in the planning stage. And let's go briefly through these. I think some of these are probably a bit more interesting than others. The first one, right off the bat, unmet medical needs. This is, of course, subject to a lot of discussions currently in Brussels, and the HTA Coordination Group also acknowledged this in the guidance, and they say that this definition, which is currently in the general pharmaceutical legislation, is the subject of ongoing debates and could change. So the working definition we have right now is an unmet medical need. It's a condition for which there exists no satisfactory method of diagnosis, prevention, or treatment as authorized in the community, or even if such a method exists, in relation to which a medicinal product concern will be of major therapeutic advantage to those affected. So again, major therapeutic advantage or lack of existing therapy.
A question, quick one, Matias, on this one.
Yeah.
This definition is from the general pharmaceutical legislation, it's not from the EU HTA, right? Okay.
Yes, yeah. Exactly, and that's why. So of course, this is currently under debate, under discussion, and I think there's been discussions of tying this definition of unmet medical need to the periods of incentives that the companies can receive for the product. So this, of course, can really change.
Good. Can I come in with those other 2 points here very quickly? I know we're doing well on time, more or less. We will manage, but just wanted to make sure we address the question whenever they come in a way. The one is from Adam to somewhat, I think, also confirm in a way that there will be factual effects in the conclusions, even though there are no official conclusions. And I very much agree with that point. The other one is from Henning to ask a question on the EU, on the IT platform. I mean, we've seen that many of like the legislative files, like the clinical trial regulation, they depend on IT platforms, and it can take ages to implement them.
Yeah.
So, any idea on where we stand on the IT platform? I think such a system wouldn't be up and running without such an IT platform. So, I would assume that it should be up and running in a way. I hope so. Any ideas?
Yeah. So yeah, I will say the European Commission have been quite transparent on this because they have an ongoing rolling plan of implementation that you can find on the Commission website. However, it's not. It's the way it looks now is basically like a secure SharePoint folder system, so it's not super advanced either. Hopefully, this can be set up as we go along, but it is up and running, and they're implementing more parts of it. In order to gain access to this HTA IT platform, you have to contact the European Commission, and it has to be in relation to either a request for JSC or in advance of a submission for regulatory authorization from the EMA, where you then also expect to come under the joint clinical assessment.
Clear. Thanks so much. There's another question which I can probably take. Unmet medical need only authorize what about off-label use from Douglas? I would assume, I mean, this definition reads like a condition for which, and that condition is a condition which is approved. So someone that talks about the label of a medicine that doesn't talk about an off-label use. So when you judge, in other words, when you judge an unmet medical need, you would have to look at the label and take the off-label use off the table, I would assume. So it looks at the condition, meaning the label. So just to answer that question. Feel free to bring in more questions if you have, but I don't want to cut you short, Matias. Let's maybe continue.
No, absolutely. This is really great, and I think it's good that we have such an interactive session here today. So please keep those questions coming. Yeah, and then it says the HTA Coordination Group says that companies need to provide a description of available diagnostic prevention treatment options and the standard of care to substantiate that claim of unmet need. So the effect of available options should be described. It should describe how much the medical need is fulfilled by those options. You could provide justifications based on possible epidemiological clinical data about the disease, life expectancy, symptoms, duration, health-related quality of life. And you could also substantiate it by published literature or registries. So I think this gives a good idea for those applying for JSC how to, let's say, make your case for this unmet medical needs criterion. Then the second criterion is first in class, so no alternative with the same mechanism of action for the treatment of the disease in question is currently authorized in Europe. However, they do say if the first product with a novel mechanism of action is not yet authorized in the EU at the time of requesting a JSC, a new medicinal product with the same mechanism of action may be selected. So this implies that no HTA, where there's no HTA evaluation is available at the EU or member state level in the relevant therapeutic area. And also, if the given product has already been authorized in a different therapeutic area, may still be considered first in class in the indication for which a joint scientific consultation is requested.
I mean, it's interesting, like these are the conditions for getting a slot for the JSC, right? So I could argue I got a slot for the JSC. I either have an unmet medical need or I'm first in class. Is that a fair assumption? Or do I need to meet both criteria?
I think it's all of them seen together. So yeah.
Okay, so it's alternative criteria.
Yeah.
Or
It's and criteria. So
and
I would say yeah, A and B and C and then they will do an overall evaluation.
because I can draw some conclusions from potentially having a slot for the JSC. I can draw some conclusions, but I leave it there because it's a big word, big ticket, and a big footprint for the discussion in Brussels these days. Unmet medical need. First in class is a nice branding of a product as well. So maybe it's nice to draw some conclusions from having a slot.
Another one they mention is and spend some time elaborating on is the potential impact on patients, public health, or healthcare system. So they say that you should describe that the product should lead to likely improvements in patient survivability, morbidity, quality of life, or have a better safety profile or include prevention aspects. Should have to then meet the criteria of having an impact on public health. So the second part of that criterion C should be likely to address health threats within Europe. They say that a high prevalence of the disease and or expected high economic impact could also contribute to this criterion. And then finally, to have a potential positive impact on the healthcare system, this can be defined as a sufficient degree of probability that a product will lead to an improvement in the organization of care or treatment pathways. And then on the flip side of that coin, any potential negative impact due to complex administration and manufacturing process may also be considered. So say looking at alternatives currently on the market.
Okay. Yeah.
Then
So
final criterion there. Oh, sorry, Alex.
let's maybe jump on to the joint clinical assessment to have enough time there, maybe. But no, let's take that one very quickly. I would suggest that's the other criteria, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then on the final criteria, they're a lot briefer. So just making reference to Union clinical research priorities to make some examples there of health-related funded programs, which gives you a bit of a pointer of what to look at. So here's the contact details if you want to request to join scientific consultations. As I said, the overall timeline is 4.5 months. Of course, be aware of, let's say, those important milestones. So submission of the amended briefing package, which really kicks off the procedure. Then about 10 days before this discussion meeting, you have to submit your presentation. You can also provide, let's say, any amendments to the briefing package up until that date as well.
And it's free of charge, right?
Yes, this is free of charge, which is different from the national advice procedures. Yeah, and should mention as well, within those JSCs, it's also possible to ask questions on health economics as well. Cost effectiveness questions can be asked as well. Then you will receive advice from those specific member states which have that within their area of competence. Can developers cannot? So there's a question here from Sadia on whether companies can choose which HTA bodies to engage for JSC. So you cannot choose. They will be appointed for you based on their availability, but also based on their competence. So if you ask for example, on health economic aspects, then probably you will receive advice from someone who has that as part of their competence.
Good.
So joint clinical assessments here, very important to keep in mind that around 7 months before you submit to EMA, when you have your pre-authorization engagement with the EMA, you also need to indicate that you are falling under the joint clinical assessment procedure. At the same time, you have to also notify the HTA Coordination Group via email to the European Commission. The email address is here. After which you will receive access to an HTA IT platform, and you can upload your EMA letter of intent, and as well as let's say, establish a username so you get access to there. So you do gain access a couple half a year before you actually have to submit. So you can familiarize yourself with that. For the JCA timeline, again, it's very strict timelines. The whole procedure is kicking off just 6-7 months before you file to the EMA. And then it follows the regulatory approval pathway quite closely. Companies have only 100 days or so to prepare the dossier, which of course means you have to prepare well in advance. And there's not a lot of opportunities for discussion throughout, although you can always contact the HTA Secretariat, but there's not really any lot of fixed discussion points, except for the scope explanation meeting, and we'll go a bit into that. You might also be invited to discuss the comparators for the assessment, but this is only upon request from the HTA bodies. Now, important to keep in mind, towards the end of the whole procedure, before the draft report is being published, the companies will have the opportunity to flag anything that is commercially sensitive and which should be kept confidential as part of that exercise. This is done together with this factual accuracy check. You only have 7 calendar days to do so. It's really important to be prepared for that. And you can make your case towards the Commission on what should be kept confidential. And at the end of the day, it's the European Commission that makes a decision, and there is no formal appeal mechanism there. So to appeal this decision, you would have to go a legal route. The scoping procedure, I think this is very important. So as you saw in the first part of that's JCA assessment, it starts off by the member states and the assessors defining what the relative comparators are for the assessment. What's important to keep in mind is that this will be driven by policy questions, and it's meant to be really inclusive and reflect all member states' needs. The way that this is being done is detailed in the guidance, but in a nutshell, the assessors will develop a proposal for an assessment scope based on the summary of product characteristics and the clinical overview section of the marketing authorization application, European treatment guidelines, and alternative guideline documents, as well as inputs from patients and clinical experts. And if the assessors consider it necessary, they can invite companies to provide information for the scope. But in general, companies are not invited to propose a PICO at this stage or throughout the assessment. Then they will send out a draft proposal for a scope, which population, the indication, the comparators, and outcomes to include for the assessment to the member states in the member state PICO survey, in which they are asked to either state whether they agree with the proposed scope or whether any additional comparators are needed. And this is where it gets quite tricky, because the member states may define separate subpopulations. Off-label comparators may be included. There, of course, can be quite varying standard of care, where there's no well-defined evidence-based standard of care. You will have a comparator which will be generated called the individualized treatment. And you can have member states may request separate effect estimates against multiple different comparators. So I think this is a bit concern, is that still, even in this news guidance, we see that even though member states can agree to have a consolidation of the comparators that they request, they really have to agree to do so for the assessors in order for the assessors to consolidate those different and competing comparator requests from member states. At the same time, those draft PICOs or the PICO responses, the PICO requests from the member states will also not be shared with companies, although individual member states could choose to do so on their own. There's nothing barring them from doing it, but in general, they will not be sharing this.
Matthias, I'm looking at time, but still want to bring in those questions which come on the table. There's a question from Paul,
Yes.
which I can probably take very quickly here. What are the implications if you don't submit the dossier? What punishments can be imposed? Actually, there are no punishments in the regulation. We've looked into this recently. There's no punishment in the regulation. There's no sanction in the regulation. The sanction would have to be implemented at the national level. I would be surprised if there wouldn't be any sanctions, as we know it from AMNOG. No dossier submission, no additional benefit. There is always a sanction involved in not submitting a dossier. And I would assume that most member states would implement something like that, that if you don't submit it into the EU HTA, then there is a certain sanction. Technically speaking, they could also say then you can submit nationally, but then the whole procedure would probably fall apart at some point in time if everyone could choose. And then I go national. There's no sanction of not submitting a dossier into the JCA. So that's the answer to that question. There is another question from Henning. What about not submitting a letter of intent? Is that something you can address? It's a
Yeah, so
tough one,
this
but is
yeah,
there
so it
one?
it is a requirement per the guidance. So again, it comes down to, let's say, non-compliance, or not really following what is prescribed. So yeah, it is a requirement to do so.
Okay. But again,
The
probably no sanctions in the regulation. I haven't seen sanctions
No.
because it's so difficult to impose those sanctions at the national level and so on. So in terms of administration law, so probably no real sanction in the regulation, but maybe then sanctions at the national level later on. Remains to be seen, remains to be looked at in national legislation. There's another question on what about if you have an accelerated marketing authorization application, an accelerated procedure, an accelerated regulatory procedure at EMA, would JCA timelines be adjusted accordingly? I would assume that this has to be the case in a way, but I must say that I would have to look this up. I haven't looked into
No,
those questions.
this is absolutely correct. Yes. So this is described as well in that general overview we had included. We didn't include this just because it gets really messy. Just to visualize all of this, but indeed, if you look at, for example, the time for dossier preparation, it's 100 days in general. But then if you have an accelerated assessment procedure, then this is reduced to 60 days. So the whole JCA procedure as well is accelerated. You also have shorter time for defining the JCA scope for the member states, and for the for factual accuracy check and everything is a bit more condensed. And this is described in the guidance document as well, so you can familiarize yourself with those timelines.
Excellent. One last question, technical one. Calendar days or working days? You have on your slide, you have so many days, 100 days, 60 days. I would assume my bet is it's calendar days, because working days is difficult to define with having different bank holidays in 27 member states. Probably difficult to define a day. I mean, so is that a fair assumption? It's going to be calendar days?
Yes, this is absolutely the case. It's calendar days. In a few instances throughout, it's defined for the European Commission as working days, which probably is easier to define. But indeed, for the other timelines, it's calendar days.
Okay, thanks.
Keep those questions coming. So for the PICO consolidation, as we're saying, it is described ways that and it's quite elaborate, the descriptions, but it's also not quite clear just from reading it. How is this consolidation taking place? It says that to achieve the lowest possible numbers of comparators, the assessors might contact the member states to clarify open questions and discuss options for consolidation, especially if a PICO or PICO component is only requested by one member state. However, member states in all cases have to agree to drop a comparator. So really, unless member states agree to drop a comparator, then it might be included. So we're still in a bit of a situation where there might be a lot of comparators included and asked to compare against a lot of different treatments, all the treatments options as well across the EU. Now, the consolidated assessment scope will be shared with the member states as well as experts, so patients and clinicians, for feedback before it is adopted by the JCA subgroup. And when this then goes out to companies and you have to prepare the dossier, it's important to keep in mind that if there is no evidence available for PICO, then you will have to justify and provide a rationale for it. But it's not the case where you have to necessarily provide evidence for every PICO, or it's seen as an incomplete dossier, because in some cases there will not be any evidence available. But really, you have to provide the rationale and justification for why you couldn't provide data for a given PICO or comparator. And the guidance says this will then be assessed by the assessors, and its acceptability will be decided at the national level.
Great, thanks. We have 10 minutes left, so let's maybe continue if there's no question. For the time being, I don't see any additional question. If you have questions, feel free to bring them in. Just wanted to make sure we are time.
Yeah, I don't see any questions either, but please do come in the comments if you have them. I think this is worth looking at, because new in this guidance document is the description of what this assessment scope explanation meeting really looks like. And as we said, in the JCA, there's really limited opportunities for having interactions with the assessors. There's really one. Every company can request an assessment scope explanation meeting to take place. The purpose of the meeting is to explain the final consolidated assessment scope to companies, and they point out that it's not intended to make changes to the PICOs. No opinion or advice will be given on the appropriateness of data methods analysis to be submitted. So it's not, say, replacing scientific advice. There'll be no meeting minutes taken, and the meeting will not be recorded. However, you will have the opportunity to meet with the JCA subgroup to really discuss the PICOs and have a full good understanding of that. It can take place once per JCA. There's a fixed meeting date. It is, for now, it is stated in the guidance that this is kept to 1 hour for all companies, although I would argue that probably this should be adjusted because some companies might receive a much more complex PICO request than others, and would maybe require more than 1 hour to discuss that. So, but again, this is what has been presented in the guidance. It states that companies are advised to bring a representative from regulatory affairs, and that any patient or clinical expert that is brought to the meeting by companies will be considered as a company representative. So just a few additional information about this, but I think this is really an opportunity that would be important to leverage in the JCA. I don't see any other questions to that. So maybe we go into maybe a few of our reflections, and then happy for others to come in as well, because I think everyone is now in the same situation, trying to understand how to best navigate it, and trying to understand really how to prepare internally for this. We have put our heads together and thought a bit about what is it that's really needed here. And I think really it's very important because this is now happening earlier. It's HTA is coming in earlier, whereas previously it was happening after the marketing authorization application is happening in parallel, which means that really regulatory market access teams really need to be aware of these new requirements, new timeline, and you need to work on some new standard operating procedures that are tuned to these revised timelines. But also, of course, joint planning is needed beyond just the marketing authorization application to prepare a quality HTA dossier. There's some really short timelines in there, 7 calendar days, for example, for the factual accuracy check. So that's really something to be prepared for, to make the most out of that time. And then, of course, collaborating with global market access teams and the local teams, which of course will still remain relevant because they're the ones that will have to then work with national HTA authorities that will be looking at that JCA report that has been put together at the EU level.
Maybe Matias, addressing there are two more questions just which came before already. One is joint HTA is meant to reduce the workload cost by pooling the core clinical assessment. The worry said it will not meet national needs, prompting the application of work. I mean, my understanding is, and that gets also us a little bit back to like what are the important things to do, is that each country will feed in its PICO scheme, and you mentioned it before. So it would be a surprise if the PICO scheme looks then at the end of the day when you go national completely different, because they have the opportunity, and it's the purpose of the exercise to feed in the PICO scheme into the JCA. Now, to that question is like, of course, you can end up with, and there have been mock-ups and trials which ended up even in a rare disease with more than 8 PICO schemes. So it can be a huge burden, especially for mid-sized companies, to also submit into all those PICO schemes. Some of the PICO schemes might involve products which are really outdated as comparators. You might not always agree with those comparator selections, and so it could lead to a duplication of work, but the hope is really that it's a one-stop shop on the clinical part of the assessment and that there's no duplication. And this is also foreseen in the regulation. Is that a fair assumption? Is that a fair answer to that question from your perspective?
Yeah, I think so, because and we've heard also from the different the different member states, HTA bodies, they've been putting on these events, regional events throughout last year, and really being quite open about where they are at in terms of preparing. And even though they're at different levels in preparing for this and changing their national procedures, basically all of them are saying that, they wouldn't be putting efforts into here if they weren't going to use the JCA report. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's public bodies that are using public money, and it's hard to justify, spending so much efforts on this and then not using it. I think that they're going to have a difficult situation.
Why sending your people to Brussels and then doing it completely different? I don't think that's very realistic. I couldn't agree more. Let's continue maybe, and I have one last question in the back here, but I think we need to continue. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to bring that question.
Not at all. I think that's a really good question, and I think a lot of us been having that in the mind as well, trying to understand. And other questions that have been in everyone's mind is, I think, understanding what is in scope. We had a brief look at it today, but as you see there, it's really sometimes you need to really go a bit deeper into the products. I mean, this also has to start quite early, so 2-3 years in advance, really for study planning, so to understand what products in the pipeline will be affected, especially the oncology treatment criteria. As you see there, it has a whole separate guidance document, and this is not always clear when there's then combinations of products, and really identifying those products at risk at an early stage is really important in order to plan for the JCA, but also your launch sequence in the EU and globally. I think it's really important to plan for each of those process steps. So understanding how to receive early advice, either in a joint scientific consultation or even a national scientific advice procedure, because the slots are limited. Making really full use of the expert involvement. We didn't talk a lot about it today, but really throughout the procedure, the experts, patients, clinicians have really an important role in providing input on the draft PICOs, on the draft reports, and really throughout also in the JSC as well. So that's really, really important to understand what their role is in contextualizing the disease, the treatments, and understanding how to leverage those limited opportunities for dialogue in the scope explanation meeting, for example. How can you use that to discuss the JCA? Anticipating the comparator requests, we looked a bit into that. Really, as you see, member states will really be formulating their comparator requests based on policy questions that they want to need. So it's not always enough just to check all the clinical guidelines, European guidelines, treatment guidelines. You really need to have a good understanding of what types of comparators might be requested from the different member states, and also perhaps maybe which of those member states will be driving those discussions as well in the JCA subgroup eventually, which is where it will be consolidated. And then I think last but not least, also understanding the different study designs and methodology that applies to this assessment. We briefly mentioned it. So even if you have a particular study design, it will not be dismissed or not included in the JCA report, but how that will be seen and judged in the JCA report, how it will be interpreted, and how that then will be seen at the national level when national HTA authorities are looking at the JCA report. That's really crucial. So you need to understand how it will be evaluated, understanding the likely impact of that JCA report, and really thinking about those study designs early on. I think I had final point on expert involvement. I think we mentioned it already, but I think it's really perhaps the largest change with the EU HTA regulation, except for really changing the time frame in which we do HTA in Europe is that it's such a large involvement of experts throughout the procedure, and I think that's really something to be aware of. I see someone asked, is it possible to share your presentation slides? Absolutely. We'll be happy to share the slides, and the recording as well will be available to everyone. Don't know if we missed any questions, Alex.
I don't think so. No, maybe also to add on this one very quickly. I know we're running out of time, but definitely a procedure where experts, clinical experts, and patient voices are probably more prominent or louder than in some national procedures, especially on the patient side of things, which is positive. But on the other hand, on the downside, I think the industry involvement needs improvement. I think that's different from procedures we know from the national level. We talked about joint scientific consultations, the need for an early engagement. My key point or takeaway from also what you're presenting here is very much that coming early is key for the companies. I mean, you really need to prepare. You need to have your argumentation or story ready when you go into national scientific advice meetings. You really need to make your arguments like you do it in national procedures, using this and that is a comparator for this and that reason. You think certain endpoints are not feasible, or it's not ethical to design a trial like that. You really have to make your arguments ready, and then maybe also to convince some of those in national scientific advice procedures, if you don't get a JSC slot, to try to convince the national institutions to really for your favorite comparator and favorite PICO scheme, but arguing also that some others are buying into that PICO scheme and so on. So it's really important to come early, as we know it also from national procedures, but really to be organized and have a clear story or line of argumentation when you go into national scientific advice meetings, because you would only learn what they think in those type of meetings. Waiting for the JSC slot, which you might not get, is probably not the option. So you have to become active 2 years, 2.5, maybe even 3 years before launch by going national if there's no other option. Because I would assume that what they tell you national, they would also probably take as granted for the coordination group later on. So that's what I take. Come early and have your own arguments ready. And let's see, we will continue to really guide you through this process. We are actively involved in the HTA stakeholder network. So if you have any questions around these, about horizontal issues, please let us know. Send us an email to Matias or me. But wanted to thank you very much, Matias, and hand over back to you.
No, thank you very much, Alex. I think those are a really good food for thought for the future. And as I said, this is a webinar in a series of webinars where we look at different topics that concerns the life science in Europe. We will most likely be organizing future webinars as well on the EU HTA regulation. As I mentioned, there's still a few documents to come, Q&A documents. The first JCAs will be kicking off this year. We have having experience with the JSC. And of course, as Alex mentioned, we are active in the HTA stakeholder network and looking to support implementation of this procedure so that it really can meet its aim. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for a very interactive discussion for 1 hour. Hope you have a really nice rest of the afternoon or the morning if you're joining from overseas, and look forward to seeing you again. And as mentioned, the slides and recording will be made available to everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Matias, and the whole team in EUCOPE. Thank you.